No one remembered the boy who waited beneath the broken tower. Not the kings who rewrote history, not the priests who blessed the wars, not even the soldiers who survived them. But centuries later, the world would change because of a promise he never broke. The winter of 1319 arrived without mercy. Snow buried the northern plains of Argenfall like a silent judgment, swallowing roads, memories, and names that once mattered. The kingdom stood old and tired, its walls cracked not only by time, but by lies told too often to be believed. Bells rang in the capital that morning, not to celebrate, but to remind people they were still alive. In a narrow village beyond the eastern ridge, a boy stood barefoot in the snow. His name was Elric of Vale, though no one bothered to call him that anymore. To most, he was simply the miller's son, or worse, the orphan who waited. He could not have been more than 12, his frame thin from hunger, his coat stitched together from pieces of forgotten winters. Yet Elric did not shiver. He stood at the edge of the old stone road, eyes fixed on the horizon where the fog swallowed everything beyond it. His mother had walked that road 3 years earlier, promising to return before the next snowfall. Every winter since, Elric returned to the same spot, believing that promises, if waited on long enough, might come true. Behind him, the village prepared for survival. Men repaired broken roofs with frozen hands. Women rationed grain and whispered prayers they barely believed in. Children learned early that silence was safer than questions. War rumors traveled faster than food, and the king's banners, once symbols of protection, now meant conscription or death. Argenfall was changing. The old feudal order was cracking, though no one dared say it aloud. Lords demanded more, gave less. The church spoke of obedience while collecting gold, and the common people learned the cruelest lesson of history. Suffering was inherited. Elric's father had learned it too late. The millstone accident was what they called it, a clean phrase for a violent death. One moment, his father had been fixing the water wheel. The next, his body lay broken beneath it. No compensation, no justice. Just another name erased from the village records. That was the first time Elric understood what it meant to be invisible. The second time came when soldiers arrived. They rode in before dawn, iron boots crushing snow and dignity alike. Red and black banners marked them as the king's levy, collectors of men and grain. The villagers gathered silently, heads bowed, knowing resistance meant fire. Elric watched from the doorway of the mill ruins. A captain dismounted, scanning the crowd with bored eyes. Every household gives one, a son, a brother, a body. The war in the south requires sacrifice. No one moved. Then a hand pushed Elric forward. He didn't know whose hand it was. It didn't matter. In that moment, the village chose survival over innocence. The captain looked down at him, unimpressed. Too small. Relief briefly rippled through Elric's chest until the captain's gaze shifted. Then the boy waits, he said coldly, and waiting boys grow into soldiers. The words carved themselves into Elric's memory. That night, as the soldiers left with screaming men chained behind horses, Elric sat alone beside the frozen river. The moon reflected off the ice like a broken mirror. He did not cry. Instead, he made a promise, quiet, dangerous, and impossible. If the world was built on waiting, then he would outwait history itself. The river did not freeze all at once. It resisted at first, currents still moving beneath the surface, whispering of places beyond the village, beyond hunger, beyond fear. Elric watched it every evening, sitting on the same stone where his father once rested after long days at the mill. Now the mill was silent, its wheel broken, its purpose forgotten, much like the people who lived beside it. Winter taught patience cruelly. Each morning Elric woke before the bells, before the cold fully settled into his bones. He gathered firewood where he could, stole scraps where he must, and listened. Listening had become his greatest skill. He listened to the way adults spoke differently when they thought children were not near. He listened to the way fear changed voices. He listened to silence most of all. Silence was never empty. It carried rumors of rebellion in the south, of entire towns burned for refusing the king's tax. It carried sermons from traveling priests who spoke of divine order while eating better than most villagers had eaten in months. It carried the unspoken truth that the world Elric had been born into was rotting from its foundations. One evening, as snow fell heavier than before, Elric noticed a stranger near the old tower. The tower had once been a watch point, built generations earlier when borders mattered, and kings pretended to care about what lay beyond them. Now it stood broken, half collapsed, its stones scattered like the bones of something ancient and forgotten. The stranger sat beside a small fire, cloaked and hooded. Elric should have stayed away. Everyone knew better than to approach travelers in winter, especially children alone. But something about the man's stillness felt different. He did not fidget. He did not pace. He waited, as if the cold had no claim over him. Elric approached slowly. The man did not look up. "You've been watching me for an hour," he said calmly. Elric froze. I didn't mean—" "It's all right," the other man interrupted. His voice was low, steady. "Watching is not a crime. Not yet, at least." That caught Elric's attention. "You talk like someone who's been places," Elric said. The man finally looked up. His face was weathered, lined not by age alone, but by decisions. His eyes held something Elric could not name, weariness perhaps, or the knowledge that comes from surviving when others do not. "I've been to places history pretends don't exist," the man replied, "and I've seen what waiting can do to a person." Elric swallowed. "Waiting doesn't change anything." The man smiled faintly. "That depends on who is waiting." They sat in silence after that, sharing the fire's meager warmth. Elric did not know why he stayed, only that leaving felt wrong, as if this moment mattered in ways he did not yet understand. "What's your name?" the man asked. "Elric." "Do you know how many kings have ruled since this tower was built?" the man continued, ignoring the question. Elric shook his head. "Neither does history," the man said, "because history only remembers winners. The rest of us, we wait." Something stirred inside Elric then. Not hope, not anger, something quieter, more dangerous. "Does waiting ever end?" Elric asked. The man studied him carefully. "Only when someone decides it will." That night, Elric returned to the mill ruins with questions heavier than hunger. The stranger did not follow, but his words did. They echoed in Elric's thoughts as he lay beneath thin blankets, listening to the wind claw at broken walls. For the first time, Elric considered the possibility that waiting was not weakness. It was preparation. Days passed, then weeks. The stranger returned often, always at dusk, always by the tower. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they didn't. When they did, the man told stories of cities ruled by fear, of wars started by lies, of people crushed beneath systems they never chose. He never spoke of his own past. "Why are you here?" Elric finally asked one night. The man stared into the fire. "Because history is about to make a mistake, and someone needs to remember what really happened." Elric felt a chill deeper than winter. "Why tell me?" The man's gaze sharpened. "Because one day The world will listen to you, whether it wants to or not. That night, Elric understood the burden of waiting. It was not passive. It was heavy, and it would shape him into something the world was not ready to face.
Spring did not arrive gently in Argenfall. It came like an intrusion, mud replacing snow, rot rising from beneath the thaw and earth, truths surfacing that winter had kept buried. Roofs collapsed under their own weight. Graves revealed bones that had not been meant to see daylight again. The land itself seemed tired of pretending. Elric felt the change before he understood it. His body had grown stronger through hunger, not despite it. His hands, once soft, were calloused from labor and cold. His eyes no longer searched the road only for his mother. They searched for patterns, for danger, for meaning. Waiting had sharpened him. The stranger noticed too. "You're listening differently now," the man said one evening, as they sat by the tower watching clouds drift low and heavy. Elric said nothing. He did not need to. The village had begun to fracture. 2 families left without warning, abandoning homes generations old. A third was accused of hoarding grain and beaten in the square until their screams taught others obedience. The church sent a new priest, young, clean, obedient, who spoke louder about sin and softer about mercy. And the king's banners returned. This time they did not ask for men. They asked for boys. Elric watched from behind a cart as names were called. 13, 14, 15. Boys barely old enough to hold a sword, suddenly old enough to die for causes they would never understand. His name was not called, not yet. That night, the stranger came earlier than usual. "You can't stay," he said without preamble. Elric felt the words land before they made sense. Why? Because waiting has an expiration date, and yours is approaching faster than you think. Elric clenched his fists. Where would I even go? The man stood, his cloak catching the wind. South, toward the trade routes, toward places where ideas move faster than armies. Elric hesitated. "And you?" The older man said quietly. "I've already waited too long." They did not say goodbye properly. Goodbyes implied certainty. Instead, the stranger pressed something into Elric's hand, a small metal seal, worn smooth with age. "Do not show this to anyone unless you must," he warned. "It once belonged to a man history erased. If the wrong eyes see it, you'll die. If the right ones do, you'll learn how lies are built." Elric nodded, understanding far less than he pretended to. He left before dawn.
The road south was cruel in new ways, where winter punished openly, spring deceived, rivers swelled without warning, bandits preyed on travelers desperate enough to risk the roads, cities loomed like promises that often delivered nothing but different kinds of hunger. Elric learned quickly. He traded labor for food, silence for safety. He slept in stables, under bridges, once even in a chapel where no one prayed anymore. He saw how power shifted from crown to coin, how merchants held more influence than knights, how information, whispered at the right time, could be worth more than gold. In Greyhaven, he witnessed an execution. A man accused of treason knelt in the square, his crime read aloud in words carefully chosen to mean nothing and everything. The crowd watched in practiced silence. "Elric," the woman beside him whispered suddenly. He turned, startled. He had not given his name. She wore simple clothes, her hair bound tightly, her eyes sharp with intelligence and restraint. "You're not from here," she said cautiously. "No," Elric replied. "Good," she said. "Neither am I." They did not exchange names. Names were dangerous. Instead, they spoke of trade routes and taxes, of how kingdoms bled themselves dry chasing old ideas of glory. "You're young," she said finally, "too young to be traveling alone." Elric met her gaze. "The world doesn't care." She smiled, not kindly, but honestly. "No, but some of us do." That night, Elric realized something fundamental had shifted. Waiting had brought him to the edge of history. Movement would carry him through it. Greyhaven slept lightly. Even at night, the town breathed in whispers, footsteps on stone, doors opening just long enough to exchange goods or secrets, the distant creak of ships rocking against the docks. Elric lay awake beneath a collapsed awning, the stranger's metal seal hidden beneath his shirt like a second heart. He had not planned to stay. Staying meant being seen. Being seen meant being chosen by armies, by thieves, by causes that devoured people whole. Yet something about Greyhaven unsettled him. The town felt less like a place and more like a crossroads where lives bent sharply, never to return to their original paths. The woman found him before dawn. "You listen like someone who expects betrayal," she said, crouching beside him as if they were old friends. Elric sat up, alert. "And you move like someone who plans it." She smiled faintly. "Fair." They walked as the town woke, past warehouses heavy with spice and grain, past docks where sailors pretended not to notice the quiet exchange of contraband. She spoke as if she knew the rhythms of danger intimately. "There are men here who trade in information," she said. "Not gossip, truths that kingdoms kill for." Elric slowed. "Why tell me?" "Because you're carrying something," she replied, her gaze flicking briefly to his chest. "Something old, something inconvenient." His pulse spiked. He stopped walking. She raised her hands calmly. "I don't know what it is, only that you don't survive long with such things unless you choose a side." Elric thought of the stranger by the tower, of erased names and buried mistakes. "What sides are there?" She laughed quietly. "That's the lie. There are no sides, only movements. You either push or you get crushed." They reached an abandoned counting house near the docks. Inside, candles burned despite the daylight. Maps covered the walls, trade routes, borders, supply lines. People stood in clusters, arguing in hushed intensity. Elric felt it then, the weight of consequence. "These people," she said, "believe the old world is collapsing. They're right. They want to decide what replaces it." "And you?" Elric asked. She met his eyes. "I want the truth remembered." He took the seal from beneath his shirt and placed it in her hand. Her breath caught. "This belonged to Armand of Solon, the king's advisor who disappeared before the last war." "Elric," she said slowly, "do you know what you've just done?" He shook his head. "You've chosen," she replied, "and there's no unchoosing it." By nightfall, Greyhaven burned. Not openly, not yet, but the fires had started beneath the surface. Messengers were intercepted, ships delayed, names crossed off lists that no one admitted existed. Elric stood on the docks, watching the sea churn darkly. Waiting had taught him patience. Movement had taught him risk. But choice would teach him cost. History did not announce itself when it began to bend. There were no trumpets, no proclamations carved in stone, only small disruptions, delayed shipments, missing messengers, treaties that arrived a day too late. Greyhaven became a nerve center of quiet resistance, though no one used such dangerous words aloud. Elric learned the discipline of secrecy. The woman finally gave him a name, not hers, but one he could use. Mara. She trained him in observation first, not action. "Those who rush to change the world," she said, "usually end up reinforcing it." Days turned into months. Elric carried messages disguised as trade tallies. He memorized routes, learned which taverns were safe, which smiles hid knives. He watched men twice his age tremble at whispered phrases he barely understood, yet carried with care. He never signed his name. In the records of Greyhaven's merchants, he became a symbol, 3 dots marked beside certain deliveries. In coded letters, he was referred to only as the boy who waits. The irony did not escape him. One night, while sheltering in a warehouse, Elric overheard 2 traders arguing. "The crown is bleeding itself dry," one hissed. "Taxes, conscription, people won't endure this much longer." "They always endure," the other replied, "until they don't." That sentence stayed with Elric. When rebellion finally surfaced, it did so clumsily. A lord in the south refused tribute. A garrison mutinied. The king responded, as kings always did, with overwhelming force. Greyhaven braced itself. Mara brought Elric a parchment sealed in black wax. "This goes north," she said, "to people who will pretend they don't exist if caught." Elric recognized the seal. His heart tightened. "The tower," he whispered. Mara nodded. "The man who waited there, he's still alive, still waiting." The road north was harsher than before. Elric passed villages burned into memory, their names scratched out by fire. He saw refugees moving without direction, carrying entire lives in sacks that grew lighter with each mile. At the tower, he found the stranger exactly where he had been before. "You chose movement," the man said calmly, reading Elric's face. "And waiting," Elric replied. The man broke the seal and read silently. His expression darkened. "They're accelerating. History is panicking." Elric frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means kings sense the end of something," the man replied. "And when power fears irrelevance, it becomes desperate." He looked at Elric then, really looked at him. "You're becoming visible." Elric felt both pride and dread. The man put a hand on his shoulder. "Remember this," he said. "History is written by those who act, but it is understood by those who wait." As Elric turned south again, he understood the cruel truth. He would never be allowed to stop moving. Betrayal rarely arrived as a sudden act. It formed slowly, through impatience, through fear, through the quiet belief that survival justified anything. Elric did not recognize it at first. He only sensed a shift in rhythm, the way conversations ended a little too quickly when he entered a room, the way Mara's eyes lingered on him just long enough to measure something unspoken. Greyhaven had grown crowded. Refugees poured in from the south, carrying stories too heavy to trade for bread. Merchants whispered of blockades and vanishing caravans. The king's spies moved more openly now, no longer pretending that fear alone could not rule a population. Elric returned from the north with urgency in his steps. "They're moving faster than we thought," he told Mara that night. "The crown knows." Mara nodded, but her expression was guarded. "Then we adapt." Adaptation meant sacrifices. Meetings grew smaller. Messages were shortened, stripped of nuance. Names disappeared entirely from correspondence. Elric noticed that certain routes were no longer used, not because they were unsafe, but because they led to people who had been quietly removed from the movement. "Where is Tomas?" Elric asked one evening. Mara did not answer immediately. When she did, her voice was controlled. "Tomas talked too much." Elric's stomach tightened. "You killed him?" "I protected everyone else," she replied. The distinction felt thin. The breaking point came with the ledger. Elric had been tasked with delivering it to a contact near the coast, a simple trade record on the surface, but beneath the ink lay names, payments, and coded references tying several noble houses to illegal conscription practices. He never made it. Halfway through the journey, soldiers stopped him, not rough, not rushed, precise. "You're expected," the captain said calmly. Elric understood instantly. Someone had chosen survival over truth. He did not resist. Resistance would have confirmed everything. Instead, he waited. In a stone chamber beneath the governor's estate, Elric was questioned by a man who did not wear armor. "Do you know how rare patience is?" the man asked pleasantly. "Most people panic when they're caught." Elric said nothing. The man smiled. "That's all right. We already know what we need." Hours passed, perhaps days. Time lost meaning in the dark. When the door finally opened again, it was Mara who stood there. Relief surged, then fractured. "You did this," Elric said quietly. Mara's face did not change. "I chose continuity. You chose them." "I chose us," she corrected, "or what will remain of us." She leaned closer. "You were becoming a liability. Symbols attract attention." Elric felt something inside him settle. Not anger, not despair, understanding. History will remember you as a footnote. Mara hesitated. History doesn't remember losers. No, it remembers survivors. They let him go at dawn, not out of mercy, but calculation. A watched man was more useful than a dead one. As Elric walked away from Greyhaven for the last time, he understood the final lesson of waiting. The greatest betrayals or committed by those who once stood closest. Exile did not announce itself with chains or guards. It arrived as absence. Greyhaven fell behind Elric like a bad memory, too sharp to forget, too distant to confront. No one followed him. No one needed to. The knowledge that he was being watched clung to him like damp cold, unseen yet unmistakable. He traveled without destination. The roads were fuller now, not with trade but with displacement. Families moved as units of grief. Mothers clutching children too old to cry, fathers silent with the weight of failure. Everywhere Elric went, the same question hovered unspoken. How long can this last? In the market town of Belmore, he heard the answer whispered, "Not much longer." The crown had raised taxes again. Grain was seized before it reached mills. Local lords, desperate to stay favored, enforced laws with cruelty they could once deny responsibility for. Hunger had become policy. Elric kept his head down, his ears open. He worked where he could, loading carts, repairing roofs, copying letters for merchants who did not ask why a boy wrote like a scholar. At night, he listened. Patterns emerged, the same names repeated, the same roots disrupted. History, he realized, was not chaos, it was machinery, and someone was turning the gears too fast. In Belmore's outskirts stood an old archive, once maintained by monks who believed knowledge was sacred. Most had fled. A few remained, stubborn and afraid. Elric found shelter there. Among dust and rotting parchment, he read what the world had forgotten. Treaties that contradicted sermons, census records that exposed lies about prosperity, letters between nobles revealing fear rather than confidence. The truth was not hidden. It was buried beneath indifference. One night, as rain battered the archive's broken windows, an old man approached him. "You read like someone searching for leverage," the man said. "I read like someone searching for cause," Elric replied. The old man nodded slowly. "Then you should know, records are disappearing, not burned, removed." Elric's pulse quickened. By whom? People who understand that history shapes loyalty, and loyalty shapes survival. That night, Elric made another choice. He began copying. Not entire books, that would have been foolish. Instead, fragments, names, dates, contradictions. He memorized more than he carried. What he wrote, he hid. What he learned, he spread carefully. Waiting had taught him patience. Betrayal had taught him caution. Now knowledge would teach him power. By the time soldiers arrived in Belmore weeks later, Elric was already gone, but the machinery had begun to grind unevenly, and somewhere unseen, history felt resistance. Truth moved slowly. It had to. Speed attracted attention, and attention brought fire. Elric understood this now. The fragments he carried were not weapons meant for battlefields. They were seeds, meant to be planted where silence had grown too comfortable. He traveled along forgotten paths, avoiding main roads, following pilgrims and traders who moved beneath notice. In each place, he left something behind, a copied decree here, a whispered contradiction there, a date that did not align with the king's proclamations. People did not rise in rebellion. Not yet. They began with doubt. In the river town of Calder's Reach, a crowd gathered when a tax collector arrived with soldiers. The collector read aloud a royal order claiming emergency grain shortages. Someone in the crowd asked a question, a simple one. Then why did the census record a surplus? The collector faltered. Doubt spread faster than anger ever could. Elric watched from the edge of the crowd, unseen. In a monastery near the hills, monks quietly corrected their sermons. They spoke less of divine obedience and more of moral responsibility. Words shifted, emphasis changed. No one noticed except those listening carefully. The crown noticed eventually. Messages circulated warning of false records, of forged documents meant to destabilize order. Rewards were offered for information leading to the source. Elric became careful in new ways. He stopped staying in one place more than 3 nights. He changed his gait, his accent, even his posture. He learned the discipline of anonymity so deeply that sometimes he wondered who he had been before. Yet the movement grew. Not centralized, not named. That would have made it vulnerable. Instead, it existed as a shared awareness, a growing discomfort with the official story. One evening, in a village whose name Elric never learned, a woman approached him quietly. "You left something behind," she said. Elric's hand moved instinctively toward the knife he rarely needed. She placed a folded scrap of parchment in her palm. "It saved my husband," she said. "They couldn't conscript him once the records were questioned." She did not thank him. Gratitude drew lines of connection best left blurred. As she walked away, Elric felt the strange weight of consequence settle again. History was no longer happening around him. It was responding to him. By the time winter threatened once more, the kingdom had changed. Not visibly, not in ways songs would celebrate, but the gears slowed. Orders were challenged. Officials hesitated before acting. The illusion of inevitability had cracked, and cracks, Elric knew, were how structures fell. Power ignored discomfort until it could not. At first, the crown dismissed the irregularities as coincidence, clerical errors, local incompetence, the usual friction of governing a restless land. But coincidences accumulated. Taxes arrived late. Conscription lists were questioned. Entire towns delayed compliance without openly refusing it. Delays frightened rulers more than rebellion ever did. In the capital of Argynfall, council chambers filled with arguments instead of certainty. Advisors spoke in careful phrases, blaming one another without naming the real threat. The king listened in silence, fingers resting on the arm of his chair, his eyes fixed on nothing. "There is a pattern," one advisor finally said. "Someone is undermining legitimacy." The king's gaze sharpened. "Find them." Orders spread outward, not with banners, but with sealed letters and quiet authority. Men trained to notice absence rather than presence were deployed. Archivists loyal to the crown were instructed to audit records. Priests were reminded where their protection came from. History began to push back. Elric felt it before he saw it. Roots that had once felt safe grew tense. Taverns where information flowed freely became guarded. People spoke more softly, glanced over shoulders more often. The movement he had nurtured was no longer invisible. It was merely unnamed. In a border town near the old marshlands, Elric narrowly avoided capture. A courier recognized the cadence of his questions. A soldier lingered too long near his table. Elric left before his meal cooled, slipping through alleys slick with rain, his heart steady despite the risk. Waiting had taught him not to panic. He crossed into the marshlands at night, traveling where roads dissolved into mud and reeds. There, among fishermen and outcasts, the crown's reach thinned. It was there he received the message. A boy, no older than Elric had once been, approached him silently and placed a strip of cloth at his feet. Sewn into it was a symbol Elric recognized, 3 dots. The movement had found him. The message was brief, memorized rather than written. They know you exist. They don't know who you are. Elric exhaled slowly. Anonymity had been his shield. Now it was thinning. That night, as he watched fog drift across the marsh, Elric understood a truth he had avoided. He could no longer remain only a shadow. If history was going to remember anything, it would need a shape, even if not a name. Elric moved with precision. Each step calculated, every shadow a potential ally, every lighted window a possible threat. The marshlands were his temporary sanctuary, but sanctuary had limits. His message had to reach the northern settlements. Information that would prevent needless deaths, expose corruption, and shift loyalties in ways even the crown could not anticipate. He traveled lightly, carrying only essentials and the fragments of copied records that had begun to define his unseen influence. His knowledge had weight. It could topple lives and shape destinies. Yet, for all its importance, it was invisible to most, hidden beneath the guise of a boy who waited. At dawn, he reached a village cloaked in fog. Its streets were quiet, houses shuttered, the air heavy with suspicion. He found the contact, a scholar exiled for questioning the king's policies. Elric handed over the coded parchments, watching carefully as the man read. "Where did you get these?" the scholar asked, eyes wide. Elric offered nothing but a calm gaze. "From the truth itself," he said. "Carry it carefully." The scholar nodded, understanding without speaking. Together they secured the documents and arranged a network for wider dissemination. For the first time, Elric felt the stirrings of tangible impact. History was moving, slowly, imperceptibly, but it was moving. That night, as he slept under the skeletal branches of marshland trees, Elric heard voices approaching. Soldiers. Not random patrols, men trained to notice patterns, trained to anticipate movement, trained to enforce obedience. He slipped silently from his hiding place, heart steady, memories of waiting and betrayal guiding him. For the first time, Elric realized that being invisible was no longer enough. Action required visibility, and visibility carried danger. By the time dawn broke, Elric had crossed into deeper marshes. The soldiers searched, questioned villagers, inspected roads, and found nothing. The shadow had become legend, whispered among those who opposed the crown quietly. Elric allowed himself a rare thought. He was no longer just waiting. He was shaping history. Yet even as pride stirred within him, he knew that every step forward carried risk. Exposure was only the beginning, and the world, unprepared for a boy who moved like a shadow, would not wait patiently for him. By the time Elric reached the Midlands, the subtle changes he had initiated were beginning to ripple outward. Towns that had once obeyed without question now hesitated. Merchants whispered of missing shipments, of taxes that seemed impossible to calculate. Nobles argued over documents that contradicted themselves, unsure which of their own records could be trusted. Elric observed quietly from the shadows. Every decision, every fragment of truth he had disseminated had begun to interfere with the Crown's carefully maintained narrative. He no longer needed to confront anyone directly. The machinery of governance was self-sabotaging under the weight of doubt. The marshlands had taught him patience. Greyhaven had taught him caution. Now, movement taught him influence. He met Mara in a hidden settlement deep in the forested hills. She looked older, her face etched with both worry and determination. "They're adapting," she said immediately. "The Crown has noticed inconsistencies. They are hunting more efficiently." Elric nodded. "Then our network must grow faster." They spent days coordinating couriers, forging messages that appeared authentic, correcting inconsistencies, and planting doubts where obedience had been assumed. It was a dangerous game. One misstep, and the Crown's forces could obliterate everything they had worked for. But they were careful, too careful. One evening, as dusk bled into night, Elric witnessed the unintended consequences of their actions. A small village near the trade routes refused to deliver the harvest to the appointed lord, claiming discrepancies in the record. Soldiers arrived, guns drawn, but hesitated when they saw the confusion in the local magistrate's ledger. The confrontation ended without bloodshed, not because of diplomacy, but because doubt had already sown paralysis. Elric realized then, history was learning to hesitate. Yet even as hope stirred, he sensed a shadow approaching. Letters intercepted, couriers delayed, strange travelers in settlements asking questions too pointed for normal curiosity. The Crown was closing in, and in the midst of this rising tension, Elric felt the first pangs of fear, not for himself, but for those he trusted him, whose lives now depended on his careful orchestration. Patience, secrecy, and calculated risk had brought him this far, but Elric knew the next step required courage, not waiting. The Crown could ignore whispers no longer. Reports arrived daily, delayed shipments, questioned decrees, towns acting against orders without explanation. Advisors pored over documents, muttering about impossible coincidences. The king, silent in his chamber, finally summoned his most trusted strategist. "Find the one behind this," the strategist said. "The boy, the shadow. Whoever manipulates our records must be stopped." Elric felt the pressure before he saw the signs. Couriers slowed, villagers glanced too often at strangers, and a new layer of soldiers began patrolling previously ignored roads. Someone, somewhere, was connecting the dots. He and Mara convened in a hidden clearing deep in the forest. Lanterns burned low, casting long shadows across the maps spread before them. "They're organizing a hunt," Mara said, her voice low but steady. "They know there's a network. They don't know who leads it, but they'll find out." Elric studied the maps, tracing paths, evaluating risks. "Then we must move faster than they can anticipate." Over the next weeks, they expanded their network, teaching trusted allies how to read patterns, how to interpret inconsistencies, how to become invisible within plain sight. They spread misinformation, corrected critical records, and orchestrated events so that any observer would misjudge the sequence of actions. In one Midlands town, Elric observed soldiers confronting a merchant for withholding grain. The merchant calmly displayed a ledger Elric had subtly altered weeks earlier. The soldiers, seeing the discrepancy, hesitated. The crowd murmured. Authority faltered. Elric realized something profound. History could be manipulated not by force alone, but by guiding perception. Yet every small victory carried a cost. Travelers disappeared, couriers were questioned and vanished. Towns that had once been quiet now braced themselves for retaliation. Elric felt the weight of responsibility more keenly than ever. One night, Mara leaned close, whispering, "You've become too visible." Elric understood. He had been cautious, patient, and careful, yet his actions had left a trail, and the crown, relentless in its pursuit of order, would follow that trail. He looked at the stars above the forest, feeling the immense span of history pressing down on him. Every movement, every action, every secret letter could tip the balance between survival and annihilation. Elric exhaled slowly. The shadow could no longer hide. The game had entered its most dangerous stage. Elric had crossed from shadow into inevitability. The crown now pursued not rumors, but a figure, a moving, calculating presence that had begun to shape events without ever naming itself. Soldiers scoured towns, scrutinized archives, and intercepted couriers. Every step Elric took required a balance of stealth and precision. One miscalculation could unravel months of carefully woven resistance. He moved through villages that once feared kings blindly, now trembling with the possibility that obedience was not absolute. Grain taxes were questioned, forced conscriptions ignored, and mercenaries found themselves paralyzed by the appearance of small, seemingly unconnected truths. Mara joined him at the edge of a misted valley. Her face bore the weight of countless sleepless nights. "We're pushing too far," she said. "The crown will act decisively soon. They'll want an example." Elric's gaze lingered on the distant towers of a fortified city, their stone walls catching the first light of dawn. "Then we must ensure it's the right example," he said. Together they planned the next move. Letters disguised as trade communications, carefully altered ledgers, whispered rumors, all designed to misdirect the king's forces while safeguarding towns and innocents. Every action was measured, every delay calculated. But even as they worked, Elric felt the personal cost. Villagers he had once aided disappeared under mysterious circumstances. Trusted allies vanished without warning. The strain of secrecy and constant movement began to erode the boundary between caution and fear. One night, in a forested hollow, Mara confronted him. "Do you understand what you've become?" she asked, voice barely audible above the wind. Elric considered the question. "I am not who I was," he admitted. "I am a shadow, a fragment, a conduit. History moves because I force it to, not by strength, but by patience, calculation, and the truth others refuse to see." Mara nodded, but her eyes revealed doubt and sorrow. "And if the crown finds you?" He looked beyond her, toward the horizon where city lights blinked faintly in the gathering dark. "Then history will have a price, but it will endure." Elric realized then that waiting, patience, and careful action were no longer enough. The moment of reckoning approached. The shadow must become a presence, and every choice from this point forward would carry consequences not just for him, but for everyone whose lives had been shaped, knowingly or unknowingly, by his actions. The weight of legacy settled upon his shoulders, heavy but inevitable. And for the first time, Elric understood the true cost of shaping history without a name. The crown's pursuit had become relentless. Elric could feel it in the eyes of soldiers in every town, in the questions asked too pointedly by merchants, in the quiet disappearances of those who had once aided him. The game was no longer about subtle influence. It was about survival, and the survival of the truths he had carried across the kingdom. He moved under the cover of night, guiding couriers along hidden paths, delivering messages that challenged the crown's authority and empowered ordinary people to question, to hesitate, to act. Every step was precise, every action calculated to maximize impact and minimize exposure. Mara accompanied him one last time, her presence both comfort and reminder of the fragile human connections that still mattered. "Once we do this," she said, "there is no turning back." Elric nodded. He knew. There was no undoing the network, no erasing the ripples that now extended far beyond their control. By now, towns spoke in coded words, merchants conveyed warnings without writing a single letter, and even the king's own advisors began to second-guess their orders. At the edge of the capital, they found a safe house, abandoned, hidden, overlooked by history itself. Inside, Elric spread the final documents, fragments of truth meant to illuminate corruption, hidden contracts, and deliberate manipulations that had allowed the crown to rule unchecked for decades. "Once this is out," Mara whispered, "everything changes." Elric paused. He understood the gravity. The truth would reach the people, but the crown would strike back. Many would suffer, yet history would remember the cracks, the hesitation, the seeds of independent thought. He released the documents into the network. Couriers dispersed silently, carrying knowledge like a silent rebellion. Within days, reports of confusion, dissent, and unexpected resistance reached even the highest offices. The crown faltered, not in open rebellion, but in uncertainty. Elric watched from the shadows as the first wave of realization spread through the kingdom. Villages, merchants, and nobles all began to question what they had been told. Obedience faltered, and for the first time the world responded not to authority, but to truth. Mara stood beside him, her hand brushing his. "It's done," she said softly. "Yes," Elric replied, eyes on the distant city lights. "History bends, but it remembers." In the quiet aftermath, he understood that waiting had been preparation, movement had been influence, and the weight of legacy had been survival. He had no name in the chronicles, no monument in stone, but in every hesitant glance, every questioned decree, every act of courage inspired by truth, he existed. The shadow became legend, and history finally learned to bend.